Con Thien was never meant to become a symbol. When the Marines first carved their outpost into the red clay 2 miles south of the demilitarized zone, it was simply one more point on the map, an elevated patch of ground chosen for its view toward the north. But the hill's quiet beginnings would soon stand in stark contrast to the ordeal that followed. Con Thien would turn from an observation post into one of the most relentlessly shelled positions of the Vietnam War, a place where endurance became the only measure of success. The Marines who rotated through the hill in early 1967 described a landscape that looked almost benign. The winds were harsh, the sun unforgiving, but the threat felt distant. They dug trenches, fortified bunkers with sandbags and steel plating, strung wire along the perimeter, and built firing positions that looked toward the tree lines concealing North Vietnamese movements. In those early months, the outpost was more defined by monotony than danger. Daily patrols, periodic sniper fire, and a few scattered mortar rounds that landed without rhythm or purpose. That calm, however, was misleading. What planners in Washington envisioned as the first anchor point of the electronic and physical barrier known as the McNamara Line required far more than patrols and barbed wire. As construction expanded, sensors, minefields, and fortified positions, the hill's importance grew. And in war, importance draws fire. By mid-1967, the North Vietnamese army identified Con Thien as a central obstacle to their movement along the DMZ. They saw the hill not just as an outpost but as a strategic statement, America's attempt to draw an immovable line on Vietnamese soil. And so they targeted it with an intensity rarely seen in the conflict, leveraging artillery hidden within cave systems north of the DMZ. These guns, protected by reinforced rock, could fire with impunity, their shells arcing over the border and slamming into Marine positions with devastating consistency. The transformation was underway. The quiet hill was becoming something else entirely, a proving ground of endurance. What made Con Thien uniquely punishing was not a single battle but the unbroken rhythm of artillery fire that defined daily life. By late summer 1967, the North Vietnamese had turned the hill into a fixed target, adjusting their fire with mathematical precision. Marine patrols reported hearing the distant thud of NVA 130mm guns long before the shells arrived, an unmistakable warning that gave them seconds, and only seconds, to brace for impact. The Marines called it the longest 30 seconds in Vietnam, that brief span between hearing the guns fire and waiting for the explosion that might land anywhere. The NVA's artillery advantage came from terrain. Their guns were positioned north of the DMZ, often hidden inside caves bored into limestone hills. From there, they could fire southward while remaining almost invulnerable to counter-battery fire. American radar could track the trajectory, but political restrictions prevented crossing into the DMZ with ground forces, and the hardened caves resisted even the heaviest aerial bombardment. Con Thien was trapped in a deadly geometry, caught inside an enemy artillery fan that it could not escape and could not silence. Marines learned to measure time not by hours but by barrages. The randomness of the shelling was its own psychological weapon. Sometimes 2 hours passed without a round. Sometimes 200 shells fell before a man could finish heating a ration can over a block of C4. Trenches flooded with monsoon rain became muddy channels where movement meant risk, but staying still meant becoming predictable. Bunkers were reinforced again and again, yet no amount of timber and sandbags could guarantee survival against a direct hit. Still, the hill had to be held. Con Thien anchored the western flank of the barrier system under construction. If it fell, the entire concept of a fortified DMZ line would collapse with it. Washington insisted it be defended. The NVA insisted it be destroyed. And caught between those two absolutes were young Marines who spent every waking moment under the possibility of death from above. Day after day, the artillery shaped not only the battlefield but the men themselves, pushing them toward an endurance few could have imagined when they first climbed the red clay slope that as the shelling intensified. The broader fight around Con Thien revealed just how costly the hill had become. In early July 1967, the NVA launched coordinated attacks designed not only to pressure the outpost but to bleed the units operating around it. The most devastating of these came with Operation Buffalo on July 2nd, when Marines of the 1st Battalion, 9th Marines moved north toward the village of Con Thien. They entered a deadly stretch of elephant grass and hedgerows, terrain the NVA had spent months preparing. The ambush that followed was one of the deadliest single days for Marines in the entire Vietnam War. Hidden machine gun nests and 57mm recoilless rifles opened up at close range. Mortars bracketed the column, and anti-personnel mines laced the approach routes. The NVA exploited every advantage of terrain. Narrow lanes, dense foliage, and pre-registered kill zones that funneled Marines into lethal crossfire. By the time reinforcements arrived, 19 had suffered catastrophic losses. Over 80 Marines killed and more than 100 wounded in a matter of hours. The unit would earn the grim nickname, the Walking Dead, a reflection of the relentless casualties it endured throughout the war. For the men holding Con Thien, stories from that ambush were not distant events, they were warnings. Patrolling outside the wire meant stepping into territory meticulously prepared by the NVA. Even routine movements were shadowed by risk. Foot patrols probing for infiltration routes, engineers clearing minefields under sporadic fire, and resupply convoys rolling forward along Route 561, each trip becoming its own gauntlet of ambushes and artillery interdiction. Inside the perimeter, the Marines watched the horizon knowing the enemy understood every approach to the hill. Outside the perimeter, they saw how quickly an entire company could be shattered. These two realities fed each other, intensifying the psychological strain. Con Thien was not a single battle but a sustained environment of attrition. One where the boundary between survival and loss was measured in seconds, inches, and routines repeated under constant threat. The ambush at Con Thien made one truth unmistakable. The struggle for Con Thien was not confined to the hilltop. It extended across the surrounding landscape, shaping everything that would come next. By late 1967, Con Thien had become more than a battlefield. It was a pressure chamber where physical danger and psychological exhaustion blended into a single, unbroken strain. The monsoon season turned trenches into rivers of red clay, filling fighting positions with water that never fully drained. Marines stood for hours in mud that pulled at their boots and soaked through their uniforms. Trench foot, fungal infections, and persistent fevers became nearly as common as shrapnel wounds. Life on the hill was not measured in days but in rotations, 30 days in the barrel, then relief followed by another unit stepping into the same crucible. What made Con Thien distinct was the absence of predictable rhythm. Combat elsewhere in Vietnam often followed patterns of movement, ambush, or counterattack. Con Thien's enemy was consistency itself. Shelling that arrived at dawn, at midnight, during meals, during sleep, without warning or pause. The cumulative effect eroded concentration, confidence, and sleep. Men described drifting into shallow rest only to wake at the crack of incoming rounds, unsure whether they had dreamed the danger or narrowly survived it. This constant vigilance, demanded by the threat from above, became its own source of fatigue. Still, there were moments that revealed the resilience holding the hill together. Resupply helicopters descended through smoke and dust, their rotor wash kicking up debris as crews unloaded ammunition and evacuated the wounded under fire. Corpsmen moved through trenches during barrages, tending to casualties with practiced calm. Units rotated in with little time to adjust, yet they quickly aligned themselves to the routines that had kept others alive. Checking bunker supports, reinforcing overhead cover, and memorizing the safest paths between positions. Through all of it, Con Thien remained in Marine hands. Not because of strategic clarity, Washington's barrier system would eventually be abandoned, but because the Marines treated the hill as a responsibility, not a symbol. They held it because that was the mission, and because the man beside them depended on it. The NVA poured nearly a year of artillery into the outpost, hoping to break its defenders. But the hill withstood the bombardment for 300 days, and the Marines who endured it refused to yield.